He said it in front of 40 people. Not a whisper. Not a mutter under his breath he thought I wouldn't hear. He said it loud enough that the music stopped, loud enough that my mother's wine glass froze halfway to her lips, loud enough that our neighbor's little girl looked up from her plate of cake. "Shut up, who asked you, fool?" That was it. 6 words. 6 words from the man I had loved for 11 years, spoken across our own dining room table, in front of our own wedding anniversary guests, while I was mid-sentence telling a story about the night we met. I remember the silence after. It had a texture to it, that silence thick and cold, like something you could reach out and touch. Someone's fork clinked against a plate. Somewhere a chair creaked. And I just sat there, my mouth still slightly open around the words I never got to finish, feeling my face go hot and then strangely, terribly numb. My name is Claire. I was 36 years old on the night my marriage ended, though I didn't know it yet. I want to tell you what happened, not just that night, but the morning after, because that's really where this story lives. That's where I learned who Daniel truly was, not in the outburst. Outbursts can be explained away, can't they? People say things they don't mean. It was the morning after that broke something in me for good. But let me back up. Let me tell you how we got to that table. Daniel and I met in a bookstore, of all places, on a rainy Tuesday when neither of us had any real reason to be there. I was 25. He was 27, wearing a gray sweater that made his eyes look almost silver, and he'd asked me completely out of nowhere whether I thought Anna Karenina deserved her ending. I didn't even know the man's name yet, and already we were arguing about literature like old friends. That was Daniel, charming in a way that made you forget to ask questions. Warm in a way that made you feel chosen. We married 2 years later, in a small ceremony in my parents' backyard. Under string lights, he'd spent an entire weekend hanging himself because he wanted, he said, for everything to be perfect for me. I believed him. I believed him for a long, long time. For most of our marriage, Daniel was good to me. Not perfect, no one is, but good. He remembered how I took my coffee. He drove 40 minutes out of his way once in the middle of a snowstorm because I mentioned offhand that I missed the bakery from my college town. He wasn't a man who yelled. That's the part I keep circling back to even now. He wasn't a man who yelled. Until he was. It started small, the way these things always do. I think we tell ourselves stories about the men we love, and we edit out the early warnings because they don't fit the narrative we've already written in our heads. A sharp comment here. An eye roll there. A joke at my expense that landed just a little too hard, followed by "I'm kidding, Claire, relax," when I didn't laugh fast enough. Over the last 2 years, it got worse. Slowly. So slowly I almost didn't notice, the way you don't notice a room getting darker if you're the one sitting inside it as the sun goes down. He started correcting me in front of people. Small things, the year we visited Portugal, the name of the restaurant where we'd had our first anniversary dinner. Things that didn't matter, except that he always corrected me with this particular tone, this flat, patient, condescending tone, like he was explaining something to a child who kept forgetting. I told myself he was stressed. His construction firm had taken on too many projects that year. I told myself a lot of things. Our 11th anniversary fell on a Saturday in October. I wanted to celebrate properly, not just the two of us, but with the people who had watched us build this life. My parents drove in from 3 hours away. My sister Meg came with her husband, Daniel's business partner, Rick, and his wife. Our next-door neighbors, the Hendersons, who'd known us since we bought the house. I spent 2 days cooking. I wanted it to feel like something out of a memory we hadn't made yet, the kind you'd look back on and smile. Dinner went beautifully at first. Wine flowed. My father made a toast that had my mother dabbing her eyes with a napkin. Someone put on music low in the background. And then, somewhere between the main course and dessert, my sister Meg turned to me and said, "Tell them the story, the bookstore story. You never tell it right when Daniel tells it." So I did. I started telling the story of the rainy Tuesday, of Anna Karenina, of the gray sweater. I was smiling. I remember I was smiling because it still felt like the best memory of my life. I got to the part where Daniel had asked for my phone number using a paper bookmark, because he said actual conversation felt too easy for someone worth remembering. Rick laughed. My mother made that soft, delighted sound she makes at romantic things, and I turned toward Daniel, expecting to see him smiling too, the way he always did when this story came up. He wasn't smiling. He was looking at his plate, jaw tight, a muscle working near his temple. And when I said, gently, teasing, "Right, honey, that's how you remember it too," something in his face just shifted, closed off, like a door swinging shut. "It wasn't a bookmark," he said, flat, cold. "What?" "It was a receipt. You always get it wrong. You always have to make everything sound more." He stopped, exhaled hard through his nose, and I watched him decide, right there in front of everyone, to keep going instead of letting it go. "You always have to romanticize everything. It's exhausting." The table went quiet in that first, smaller way. The way tables go quiet right before something worse happens, when people start recalculating whether to laugh or look away. I felt my cheeks burn, but I tried to keep my voice light. I tried to save it, the way you try to catch something falling before it shatters. "Okay," I said, with a small laugh that didn't sound like a laugh at all. "Receipt, then. I stand corrected. I just remember it as a Claire. As more romantic, I guess, because that's how it felt to me, and I don't think it matters if it was a bookmark or a..." "Shut up." His voice cracked across the table like something breaking. "Who asked you, fool?" I have replayed those 5 seconds of my life more times than I can count. I have turned them over and over, examining every angle, trying to understand how a man who once hung string lights in a snowstorm could look at me, at his wife, in front of her own parents, on their own anniversary, and speak to me like I was something beneath him, something not worth the air it took to answer him. Nobody moved. My mother's hand found my father's arm. Meg's mouth had fallen open. Rick was suddenly, intensely focused on his wine glass, and the Hendersons, I couldn't even look at the Hendersons. I sat there in my own dining room, in the dress I'd bought specifically for that night, feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my entire life. "Daniel," my father finally said, low and warning. But Daniel just pushed back from the table, muttered something about needing air, and walked out through the sliding glass door into the backyard, leaving all of us, his guests, his wife, his in-laws, sitting in the wreckage of a dinner that, until 60 seconds earlier, had been the happiest night of my year. I don't remember exactly how the rest of the evening ended. I remember Meg squeezing my hand under the table. I remember my mother quietly starting to clear plates, giving her hands something to do because her voice wasn't steady enough to speak. I remember the Hendersons leaving early, murmuring something about an early morning, their faces careful and apologetic in that way people get when they've witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. Daniel came back inside 20 minutes later and acted, unbelievably, as if nothing had happened. He topped up Rick's wine. He laughed at something on his phone. And every time I caught his eye across the room, he looked at me with something almost like irritation, as if I were the one who'd made a scene, as if the humiliation had been mine to cause and mine alone to fix. That night after everyone left, I lay in bed beside him, staring at the ceiling, waiting for an apology that I was certain would come. He was a good man. I told myself that over and over like a prayer. He was tired. He'd had too much wine. He would wake up in the morning and he would remember what he'd done, and the shame of it would break something open in him, and he'd take my face in his hands the way he used to, and he would say, "Claire, I am so sorry. I don't know what came over me. You didn't deserve that." I fell asleep somewhere around 2 in the morning, still waiting. I woke up to the smell of coffee, and for one soft, foolish second, I let myself believe it meant something. I got up, pulled on my robe, and walked downstairs toward the kitchen, my heart already rehearsing how I would accept his apology, gracefully, but not too easily, because he needed to understand how much it had cost me. Daniel was standing at the counter, dressed, keys already in his hand, checking something on his phone. He glanced up when I walked in. "Morning," he said, easy, casual, as if the words "shut up, who asked you, fool" had never left his mouth, as if 40 humiliated guests had never sat frozen around our table the night before. I stood in the doorway of my own kitchen, waiting for the apology that was never going to come, and something in my chest went very, very quiet. "Daniel," I said carefully, "about last night." He looked at me the way you'd look at someone bringing up old, boring news. What about it? And in the space of that single sentence, what about it, I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the man standing in my kitchen was not going to apologize. Not that morning. Not ever, unless something forced him to. And what he said next, so calm, so unbothered, so certain of himself, was the thing that finally, truly broke me open. He set his phone down on the counter, slow and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. "You embarrassed yourself last night, Claire," he said. "Going on and on with that story like it was some big performance. I did what I had to do." I actually laughed. Not because anything was funny. I laughed the way you laugh when your body doesn't know what else to do with the shock moving through it. "You did what you had to do," I repeated. "Daniel, you humiliated me. In front of my parents, in front of our friends, you called me a fool." "I said shut up," he corrected, like the distinction mattered, like he was doing me some kind of favor by clarifying his own cruelty. "You wouldn't stop talking." It was my story to tell, our story. "It's always your story," he said, and something in his voice had an edge to it now, something that had clearly been sitting under the surface for longer than one dinner. "Everything's always about how you remember it, how you felt, what you think happened. You don't even let people finish a sentence before you're jumping in with your version." I stood there in my socks, on the cold kitchen tile, and I felt the ground under 11 years of marriage tilt sideways. "Are you serious right now?" I said quietly. "You're turning this around on me." "I'm just saying." He picked his keys back up. "Maybe if you didn't need so much attention all the time, things like last night wouldn't happen." I want to tell you I said something powerful in that moment. Something sharp and clear that let him know exactly what he'd done. But grief doesn't work like that. Not the real kind. Not the kind that arrives without warning in your own kitchen on a Sunday morning. What actually happened is that I stood very still, and I felt tears rise up hot behind my eyes, and I hated myself for it, because some old, stubborn part of me still didn't want him to see me cry over this. Still didn't want to give him that. "I need you to apologize," I said instead, my voice shaking despite everything. "Not explain, not justify, apologize." Daniel looked at me for a long moment. And here is the thing I will never forget, the thing that told me everything I needed to know about the next chapter of my life, he sighed. Like I was being difficult. Like my asking for basic decency was an inconvenience standing between him and his Sunday. "I have to go," he said. "Rick and I are looking at the Baxter property this morning." And he walked past me, close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed mine, and he left. The front door closed with an ordinary click, and I stood alone in a kitchen that still smelled like coffee, and I understood with a cold, settling certainty that nothing was going to change. Not because he couldn't apologize, but because some part of him didn't believe he'd done anything worth apologizing for. I called my sister that afternoon. Meg picked up on the first ring, like she'd been waiting. "How are you?" she said, not really a question. I told her everything, the kitchen, the coffee, the sigh, the Baxter property. I heard her exhale hard on the other end of the line. "Claire," she said, and there was something careful in her voice, something she'd clearly been holding back for a while. "Can I say something you might not want to hear?" "You're going to say it whether I want to hear it or not," I said, and for the first time all day, something close to a laugh escaped me. "Last night wasn't the first time," she said gently. "It was just the first time we all saw it." I didn't say anything for a long moment. "Remember Thanksgiving," she went on. "When he made that comment about your job in front of Mom and you laughed it off. Remember your birthday, when he corrected you about the restaurant reservation in front of the waiter, like you were confused, like you couldn't be trusted to get your own plans right. Claire, we've been watching this for a while. We didn't know how to say something." I sat down on the edge of my bed, phone pressed to my ear, and I let myself, for the first time, really look at the last 2 years. Not as isolated moments I'd excused one by one, stress, tiredness, a bad day, but as a pattern, a slow erosion. 100 small cuts that I had been quietly, faithfully bandaging on my own, telling no one, telling myself it wasn't that bad, telling myself he still loved me, because surely if he still loved me, none of it could really count. "I don't know what to do," I finally said, and it was the most honest sentence I'd spoken in months. "You don't have to know today," Meg said. "But you know something now that you didn't know yesterday. You can't unknow it." She was right. That was the terrible gift of that morning in the kitchen, not the cruelty itself, but the clarity that came after it. I had spent 2 years explaining Daniel to myself in the kindest possible light, and in one flat, unbothered, "What about it?" He had finally shown me exactly how little my pain weighed against his comfort. Daniel came home that evening around 7, whistling as he walked through the door, carrying take-out bags like it was any other Sunday. He set them on the counter, glanced at me sitting at the kitchen table, and said, "I got Thai, the one you like." As if that settled it. As if Pad CU could undo the 6 words that had detonated in front of 40 people less than 24 hours earlier. "I'm not hungry," I said. He paused, studying me, and for just a second, just one flickering second, I saw something uncertain cross his face. Maybe he sensed it. Maybe some part of him understood that this Sunday was different from all the other Sundays he'd smoothed over with takeout and silence. "Are we still doing this?" he asked, and there was real irritation in it now. "I thought we were past it." "Past it," I repeated. "Daniel, it's been 9 hours." "I don't know what you want from me, Claire." And there it was, laid bare. He genuinely didn't know. Not because he was slow or careless, but because in his mind an apology wasn't owed. He had corrected me. He had managed an inconvenient moment the way he saw fit. To him, I was the one still making it a bigger deal than it needed to be. "I want to tell you I packed a bag that night and drove to my sister's, dramatic and final, the way it happens in movies. That's not what happened. What happened is slower and quieter and truer to how these things actually go. I stayed. For 6 more weeks, I stayed, watching him, really watching him, in a way I hadn't let myself do before. I watched how he spoke to waitstaff when they got his order wrong. I watched how he talked over his own mother at dinner. I watched the small, constant ways he needed to be right, needed to be the one holding the final word in every room he stood in. And I watched myself, too, how small I had folded myself down to fit beside him. How much of my voice I had quietly handed over, one dinner conversation at a time, one "you're remembering it wrong" at a time, until an entire table of people I loved had to watch my husband call me a fool for daring to tell my own love story out loud. I told him I wanted a separation on a gray Tuesday in late November, sitting at the same kitchen table where he'd once told me he had to go. He didn't yell. He didn't apologize either, not really, not the way I'd needed him to that first morning. He just looked at me, tired, almost bored, and said, "This is because of one bad night." "No," I told him, and my voice, for the first time in a long time, didn't shake. "It's because of every night after it, where you decided I didn't deserve to hear you say you were sorry." I moved into a small apartment across town in January. It had bad water pressure and a radiator that clanked at night, and I have never, in my entire adult life, slept better than I did those first few weeks alone in that narrow bed, under that thin blanket, with no one beside me deciding whether my version of our story was worth telling. My parents still don't bring up that anniversary dinner. Meg does, sometimes, gently, usually late at night over wine, when we're both a little softer than usual. "Do you ever think about the bookmark?" she asked me once. "It was a receipt," I told her, smiling despite myself. "He was right about that, at least." But here's what I've come to understand, in the year and a half since that October night. It was never really about a bookmark, or a receipt, or which version of a rainy Tuesday was technically accurate. It was about a man who had grown so comfortable being right that he couldn't stand the sound of his wife telling a story he didn't get to narrate. It was about 11 years of a love that had quietly, slowly, turned into something that required my silence to survive. I tell that bookstore story again now, sometimes, to new friends, to people who ask how I ended up loving old paperbacks the way I do. I tell it exactly how I remember it. The rain, the gray sweater, Anna Karenina, the little scrap of paper he pressed into my hand with his number written in blue ink. I don't know anymore if it was a bookmark or a receipt. I've decided it doesn't matter. What matters is that it's my story now. Mine to tell, mine to remember, mine to shape however I choose. Nobody gets to stand up from my table and tell me to be quiet. Not anymore. And some mornings, when I make my coffee alone in that small apartment with the clanking radiator, I think about the version of myself who sat frozen at that dinner table, waiting for an apology that was never coming. I wish I could reach back through time and tell her something. I wish I could tell her that the silence after his words wasn't her shame to carry. It was his.